nctd.org with a name and or phone number and which item you would like to speak on. So now I will ask Suhail Rodriguez, interim clerk of the board, to call the roll.
Chair Bhat Patel.
Here.
Board Member Quirk. Board Member Hinsey.
Here.
Vice Chair Jenkins.
Here. Oops. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. There you.
Okay, thanks.
Great. So with that, we will go ahead and have Suhail provide safety brief and review the evacuation procedures for any of those individuals in the building.
In case of an emergency, I will dial 911. In case of an evacuation, please take the stairs. Do not use the elevators. Once cleared of the building, do not re-enter unless cleared to do so by emergency personnel. There are 5 extinguishers and first aid kits on each floor of the building. There is a portable defibrillator on the first floor and staff on hand trained on CPR procedures if needed. This concludes my safety brief.
Thank you, Suhail. And I just wanted to check in to see if there are any changes to the agenda.
No, Chair, there are no changes.
All right, perfect. And do we have any public comments?
No, Chair, we do not.
Okay, great. So at this time, we are ending the public registration to speak on this item. And before we get into the specific item on the agenda for this meeting, I want to outline the protocols to make sure that we can make it as efficient as possible. So if we can just hold our comments and questions until after the agenda item has been presented, it'll make it a bit smoother. And then second, when the time comes for any comments or questions, if you could use the raise hand function, and I will go ahead and call you in the order that I received them. So with that, we'll go ahead and start off our first agenda item. And I will call to the virtual stage Bradley Seren, our staff attorney, civil rights officer, and he will introduce our only agenda item for this meeting, which will review the disparity study conducted by NCTD and the proposed disadvantaged business enterprise goal for federal fiscal years 2023 to 2025. The PAF committee today will receive an overview and provide feedback to staff regarding the disparity study and the implementation of the proposed DBE goal for the district. Subsequently, in order to meet the Federal Transit Administration's August 1st deadline for submission of the board approved goal that supports receipt of NCTD's federal funding, this item will advance from the PAF committee to the full board for approval at the regular meeting on July 21st, 2022. So I'll go ahead and pass it off to you, Bradley.
Thank you very much, Chair Patel. So in accordance with 49 CFR Part 26, NCTD is required to analyze whether there were disparities in the utilization of its diverse firms and its contracts and in the local marketplace, and to use that to help develop a triennial disadvantaged business enterprise or DBE goal based off that analysis. In order to assist in developing that triennial goal, NCTD contracted with Keene Independent to conduct this analysis and to help develop the proposed goal for federal fiscal years 2023 to 2025. So here to talk to you about that analysis and findings is Dave, Annette, and Blanca from Keene Independent, whom I will now turn it over to.
Thank you, Bradley. With us today are myself, Annette. I'm Keene, a principal with Keene Independent. David Keene, also a principal with Keene Independent. Blanca Monteiro, senior consultant with Keene Independent, and also critical in the outreach portion was Janine Karitz, our chief listening officer. Next slide. So today we're going to talk about a number of topics. We're going to try to move as quickly as possible, and we appreciate your holding comments till the end. We're just going to explain to you why did we conduct a disparity study, what kind of information NCTD provided to us. We're going to define the market area. We're going to talk about setting the overall goal, disparity analysis, and then any recommendations, and talk about a little bit about the public comment period. Next. Dave?
Thank you. Operating the federal DBE program is a requirement to receive US DOT funds. So each transit agency of a particular size across the country operates the federal DBE program, and NCTD has been operating the program for years. NCTD is required under federal regulations to fine tune how it operates the program. And one of the components is to set an overall goal for disadvantaged business enterprise. That's DBE participation on FTA funded contracts. That goal needs to be submitted to FTA after public comment for FTA review and approval. And August 1st is the date for that. And then in addition, and this is particularly important in states in the western part of the country due to some past legal decisions. NCTD must determine whether it can meet the overall goal through neutral means or use DBE contract goals to be able to help meet its overall DBE goal. So we're going to be using the term goals in two different contexts. One is an aspirational overall 3-year goal for DBE participation. There is no penalty if NCTD does not meet that, although it will need to do a report of why it fell short of the goal if it does fall short of the goal. And NCTD has prepared overall DBE goals in the past. They run for 3 years. The other use of goals in our presentation is contract goals, which NCTD does not currently use, but actually setting a percentage goal for DBE participation on appropriate federally funded contracts and asking those prime contractors that are bidding or proposing on those contracts to attempt to meet those overall goals for the particular project. You can show compliance as a prime by either meeting that goal or showing good faith efforts that you tried to meet that goal. As part of what NCTD needs to determine is not only whether it should use that DBE contract goals program, but again, especially in states within the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, which NCT is in and California is in, NCD will need to determine the specific racial, ethnic, and gender groups of DBEs eligible to be counted towards that goal. And that is in past legal decisions over the past 16 years. An important one was the Western States paving decision that the Ninth Circuit ruled on, where it found one of the recipients of federal funds that was using the DBE program did not have adequate evidence to support the use of DBE contract goals and did not have evidence to support the groups that it was eligible for that program. That gives guidance on the disparity study that we performed to NCTD. And one of the things that happened after 2005 was a study that I performed for Caltrans that was also litigated in court, went up to the Ninth Circuit. And the Ninth Circuit, unlike that Western States paving decision, actually looked at the evidence that Caltrans had from our disparity study and approved that program. And in addition, any kind of program review or evaluation, looking at NCTD practices, making sure that they are treating firms fairly and that it's not an overdue burden on small businesses or minority and women-owned firms. That's always useful. And getting public input on your procurement practices and the marketplace in general is a helpful exercise as well. We have included that information from your constituents, the businesses in the community that are pursuing NCTD work. That was a big part of our study, and that we're going to have summarized some of that information today, but that's in our full report. Thank you. Next slide. Blanca?
Yeah, let me talk about the information that we collected for our disparity study. We collected contracts from January to 2016, 2020. We collect information about prime contractors and subcontractors that obtained a contract. We obtained subcontractor information for certified and non-certified firms. We also collect the information about firms interested in doing work with NCTD, even if those firms have not received work with a NCTD. Next slide, please. We review the spend of dollars in the area, and we we came that most of the contract dollars were spent in San Diego and Orange counties, as 84% of those contract dollars were to do these two counties. Next slide, please. As part of the disparity study, we also do quantitative evidence market of the local marketplace. We found that there were disparities in business ownership rates for minority groups. Also, we found that there are disparities in access to capital, bonding, and business revenue. As one large part of our disparity study is an availability survey. It means a survey that it was conducted to all potential firms and doing business with NCTD. And one part of that survey is about barriers to entry. Some of the results are in the next slide. Next slide, thank you. For example, minority firms report having more problems, are more likely to have problems in being pre-qualified, or have problems for insurance requirements or large size projects than white-owned firms. So that it's consistent across the board, and we also see these kind of results in other organizations. We also conducted qualitative evidence on the disparity marketplace. Hopefully there is a slide for that. If not, we can comment on that. There is no slide for that. Well, we conducted a thorough qualitative analysis, close to 100 interviews, in-depth interviews, and communications and emails received as part of this disparity study. Annette, you want to talk a little bit more about it?
Sure. As part of disparity studies, we reach out to businesses, trade associations, chambers, other interested groups, and we ask them for them to participate in in-depth interviews. We also, in our availability survey, which goes out to thousands of business owners and business leaders, we ask them an open-ended question if they're interested in a follow-up interview. And from that interview, we're able to capture potential interviewees for these in-depth interviews. What we talk about in those interviews is we ask them about any barriers to participating in projects with organizations like NCTD. We ask them about barriers to building and sustaining and growing their businesses, any barriers to working as a subcontractor to a prime, or as a prime contractor, hiring, finding and locating subcontractors. So they're in-depth. There's a lot of information that's gathered from those interviews. And that, in addition to other methods, are ways that we get additional qualitative information. So throughout the course of this disparity study, we had a designated email that led directly to us, Keen Independent, a designated study hotline, telephone hotline, where we could be reached directly, and then also a study website that was updated throughout the course of the disparity study. And on that website, we also posted once the draft report was delivered to NCTD, it was posted to that website for public comment, as well as the goal.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yes. Just want to talk about the federal requirements for a DBE goal that as 49 CFR 26 established. The first one is determine a base figure. We can consider a step 2 adjustment, upward or downward, based on evidence. And we can project a portion of the goal that can be met through neutral means, and ensure that the program is narrowly tailored. So the remedy goes to the right groups. And they will talk about each of these steps.
Okay, so there was a large survey of firms that were already known to NCTD and those that may not have been on any NCTD list. When we identified those firms in San Diego and Orange counties through Dun & Bradstreet, if they were in the types of fields where NCTD has work, or either directly or through subcontracts. So we surveyed firms, conducted a very thorough survey, many callbacks to try to get as many people on the phone as possible. And our first question is, firms were interested and qualified to do work for NCTD in many different areas. Those firms that said yes made it into our availability database. So this was an additional set of firms that we did not necessarily know whether they were minority or women-owned, or if they were certified as DBEs. And through the course of the analysis and the survey, that was one of the questions. So in our final availability database, we have many firms that have already tried to do work with NCTD, as well as those that might not have in the past, but would be interested in working with NCTD in the future. Some of those were minority and women-owned firms, and some were not. Next slide. So this gives you a head count. We just, based on the 416 firms that made it through our survey criteria, that they were qualified and interested, performed relevant types of work, and met the other criteria. The table on the left includes certified and non-certified firms. And of the 416 firms that made it into our final database, 177 were minority or women-owned. About 33% of the firms were minority-owned, and about 10% were white women-owned. Some of them, based on kind of past legal cases, male and female minority-owned firms are grouped in the top part of the table and grouped together in our results for minority business enterprises, which MBE stands for. And that's certified and non-certified firms. Now, only some of those firms are certified as disadvantaged business enterprises, going through the standard process that's in federal regulations for doing that. You know, say getting your certification through an agency such as Caltrans as a DBE. So we're reporting it this two ways. Of the 416 firms, 39 in that database were currently DBE certified, or about 9% of the total. So, but that is not your goal. We're not proposing that to be the overall goal for your FDA funded contracts, because firms are not equally available for all your different types and sizes of work, and work as a prime or as a sub. So we actually took that into account when we determined availability for both our disparity analysis and our goal analysis. Next slide. When we did take all of that into account, we found that 30% of the contract dollars would be going to MBEs, and about 6% of the contract dollars going to white women-owned firms for our disparity analysis. This is the dollar-weighted availability after taking size, type, and whether it's a prime contract or a subcontract, and the date of the contract into consideration. We actually performed an availability analysis for each one of the contracts and subcontracts that we had in the past data, and then dollar weighted the results to get to this slide. Thanks. Next slide. Here's some of the weightings that's important to come up with the overall goal. So we know that railroad and railway roadbed construction, it accounts for more than half of the dollars in the past, and we expect more than half of the dollars in the future. Public building construction was another key area. You see some of the other major types of work that we were examining here. So the goal reflects these weights. Thanks. Next slide. And here's the percentage of firms in each one of those fields that are DBEs. And then next slide. And here's our calculations of the overall weighted availability of current DBEs. So again, we're using the concept of all minority and women-owned firms in our disparity analysis, but for the goal setting, it's specific to firms that are certified as DBEs. So 16.51% is that dollar-weighted DBE availability, given the types of work that you have. Next slide. So that 16.51 does not need to be your overall goal. You can do what's called a step 2 adjustment. This is in the federal regulations. Looking at your past DBE participation for the organization is one of the things that the regulations point you to make a step 2 adjustment. And here is 4 years of past DBE participation. So it shows that generally it's been in the range of 4 to 8%. Next slide. And taking the median of that past participation of 6.15%, one of the acceptable ways of coming up with the goal is to average your current availability, that's 16.51, and the median of your past participation, the 6.15, that comes up with a figure of 11.33%. So we have a lot of math on this page, but that's simply a way of a potential goal that's allowable and suggested using the federal regulations and guidance of making that what would in this case be a downward step 2 adjustment to get to 11.33. The regulations also ask you to consider an adjusted goal that would account for past discrimination in a number of different areas, but what we're able to look at is if there's any disparities in business ownership rates. For some industries, both for people of color and for women, we did find disparities in business ownership rates. And the logic is in the federal regulations in the program that don't set a goal so low that you've kind of built in the effects of past discrimination. If you think that there's simply no availability because of discrimination, don't set the goal near zero because of that. Actually build in what availability would be but for that past discrimination. So we've developed a method of calculating what that additional adjustment would be. And if you were to use that, you would add 5 percentage points to your base figure of the 16.51 and have a goal about 22%. So these are the range of options available to you. And our job as consultants is to give you these options. In discussions with NCTD, it was determined to use the downward adjustment to get to a goal of 11.33%. So next slide. And so under any of the different options here, the next thing to do is to determine whether you can meet all of that goal solely through neutral means. Neutral means are outreach, education, trying to unbundle contracts to make them smaller, any participation you would get just by asking primes to please include DBE participation voluntarily. So we think you can get about 6% DBE participation through those neutral means. And that's a lot of what you're doing already and shown some success with already. But to meet a goal of 11.33% or higher, it does not look like those neutral means would be enough to meet the overall goal. And there would need, our projections show that there would need to be some additional use of what are called race conscious measures, and that's the DBE contract goals program. So in recent years, you've not been using the DBE contract goals. You've been meeting the overall goal through neutral means. And the past overall, most recent overall goal is 4.2%. We think based on the evidence that we're seeing in the market, that availability of DBEs is quite a bit higher than that. That goal of 4.2% is low if you compare it to other transit agencies in Southern California, with a couple of exceptions. And that 11.33 is, or even 16.51 is much more representative of the true availability that's out there. And to meet those goals, you would need to use DBE contract goals. So that's the overall assessment of the goal part of this. The next part of it is the disparity analysis to see if you would even have a legal basis to use race conscious means. Do you find disparities in your contracts? And if so, what groups might be eligible for that program? So next slide. Here we're seeing past utilization by NCTD on FTA-funded contracts of minority women-owned firms on the left, and then certified DBEs on the right. So we were finding greater participation of minority and women-owned firms than what you were historically reporting. We were finding the 17.24% participation, 11% percentage points of that are minority-owned firms, 6 percentage points of that is white women-owned firms. And that's numbers that before the disparity study you didn't have because you've only been counting firms that were certified as DBEs. So the 17% relative to other agencies is pretty good, but that's not really the key criterion here, is how that measures up against the availability of firms. And we begin to look at the disparity analysis in the next couple of slides. So next slide, please. So here we compare utilization and availability by minority group and for white women-owned firms. We found that we have disparities overall for minority women-owned firms at 17% utilization, but 36% availability. So the numbers on the right divide the utilization by the availability, and it gives an index. 100 is parity. 0 would be no utilization at all. The overall index of 47 for minority and women business participation indicates that minority and women-owned firms were getting about 1/2 of the dollars of NCTD contracts that you might expect if there were a complete level playing field. This is not a disparagement of NCTD, because we know that a lot of the discrimination against minority and women-owned firms and people of color and women as business owners occurs in the marketplace that puts firms at a disadvantage when competing for public sector work or any other type of work. We've documented that in the report. The federal DBE program recognizes that on a national basis, and we've shown that evidence for the local area. Next slide. We broke down the 2 different time periods, which we were seeing differences in contracting patterns. So here you see the disparity results for 2016 through 2018. And then in the next slide, please. We're showing the most recent time period, which we think is most indicative of what you would be looking at in the future. Here we were seeing utilization of 14% overall for minority women-owned firms, so a little bit less than what we found for the complete time period. That was lower than the 32% availability that was fine-tuned to the contracts that you had in these 2 years. We found disparities for each one of the minority-owned groups and for white women-owned firms. And those disparities were substantial. The disparity indices that we're looking at, even the 77 for white women-owned firms, the courts have ruled that that would be a substantial disparity and an indicator that action is required. So thanks for that. And we did further statistical analyses to make sure that these disparities just couldn't have happened by chance, and we were able to reject that. Next slide. I think hand this back to either Bradley or Annette.
So in the process of the disparity study, we held public workshops, virtual public workshops early on. I believe in the very beginning of the study, we held, I think, 6. We held 3 additional public workshops, virtual public workshops in May 2022. And we also, NCTD also, as part of their process for FTA, they requested consultations with 14 trade and contracting associations and other groups. We had a public comment period once the draft disparity study was posted to the study website, as well as once the proposed DBE goal was posted to the study website, as well as both were posted to NCTD website. The public comment period closed on June 20th, 2022, and during that process, we received very, very few comments, if any. So I think it was one public comment came in during that proposed public comment period, and during the public workshops, there was very limited participation and no comments.
And the important thing here is there was part of the process is to see if there's opposition to what you're proposing. And importantly, there was not.
And it's important to remember that June 20th was the close of the public comment period. So any comments that come in, that might come in now, are not included in the disparity study. Bradley's going to take the next, give us some insights into the next steps for NCTD. Next slide.
Thank you very much, Dave. Thank you very much, Dave and Blanca. So NCTD is going to propose an overall goal of 11.33% to the FTA that would start on October 1, 2022. We're going to strive to meet this goal all race neutrally. However, we will supplement with race conscious means as necessary. And we will include all DBE groups that are eligible through Caltrans or DGS to meet the contract goal of the FTA. Next slide, please. So in regards to implementing the goal, there's the race neutral measures that we're going to be implementing, which is going to be increased outreach and technical assistance for all interested parties, as well as increased information and communication programs about how to do business with NCTD, the requirements, how to bid, and everything else along that lines. In addition, there's race conscious measures that can be implemented, which is using contract goals on federally assisted contracts to meet the remainder of the overall goal that we're not going to be able to meet race neutrally. And that requires a little bit of process beforehand regarding to prepare for the bid, in that the bidder has to make good faith efforts, i.e. they have to go out there and try to get DBE subcontractors on the contract. And if they're not able to, they have to document it and explain it why in a good faith effort format. So it's a little bit more labor intensive on the beforehand. Next slide, please. Additionally, there's other race and neutral efforts include unbundling contracts to allow more opportunity for smaller contractors, providing additional information about bidding opportunities, which goes along with the outreach, as well as looking at our bonding requirements and using informal or simplified bidding procedures to help make the process go more smoothly, and also tracking all the DBE participation. We're going to be reviewing this, our progress over the next couple of months, and determine if race conscious goals are going to be implemented at that point in time. Next slide, please. So the next steps is we're going to provide the recommended DBE goal of 11.33% to the board of directors on July 21st. Barring any other comments or last minute additions, we would submit a final proposed overall DBE goal to the FTA by August 1st, 2022. If they approve it, that would begin the overall DBE goal of 11.33%, would start on October 1st, 2022. So that concludes my presentation. I'll open it up for any questions.
Great, thank you for the presentation. And before I start to take questions from the board, I'd like to check in with Suhail to see if we have any public comments for this agenda item.
No, Chair, we do not.
Okay, great. So at this time, we'll go ahead and end the public registration to speak on this item. So I'll turn to the board and see if there are any questions from the board. And I do see a couple of hands raised. So Councilmember Hinsey, you popped up first, and then, or Board Member Hinsey, and then Board Member Jenkins, if you can go after Board Member Hinsey.
Thank you for the presentation. I'm curious to know, in those initial surveys that you do with potential vendors, how do you get such high participation? Is it a requirement for them to submit for a public agency contract, or are they incentivized by giving their time to do something that's so in depth?
Blanca, you want to take that one?
Sure. We call them. We've been working with Customer Research International, that is a telephone survey company, a minority-owned firm, and they called each of these business up to 8 times, and to get them on the phone. That's the way that we got a high response. It's working with a firm that has experience in these types of survey. Also, it worked that the availability survey was announced, we have these initial town halls, virtual town halls with the community. So the community was well informed that this project was coming and were encouraged to take the phone.
And the process for the in-depth interviews is very similar. We just keep calling, emailing, contacting people. And as I mentioned before, in the availability survey, we do ask a question if they're interested in a follow-up phone call. So not only do many of them participate in we get the thousands in the availability survey, then the follow-up interviews, and I'm not sure if you were referencing those hour-and-a-half interviews are done by directly calling them, emailing them, asking them to participate, and they no incentives.
Wow. Yeah, that you have to be very persistent, but that's really valuable information that we're getting in a big time commitment from people that are probably very busy. Another question that I have is, I am interested in raising our goals. I do see the value in that. I'm curious to know if there's a penalty for not meeting these goals that we establish for ourselves.
I can quickly address that. So there is a penalty if the organization would not implement the program in good faith. Bradley could probably correct me on the exact legal language around that. And it is rare, but it's possible to withhold federal funds from agencies that are really completely out of compliance with the program. But the program is designed that there is no penalty for not meeting your overall DBE goal. As long as you're making attempts to do so, there is a requirement that you take a look at why you're not meeting it and trying to do better. But that's a good question, and these goals are aspirational. They're not quotas. The overall goal is not a quota for the organization, and there is no penalty, a direct penalty from not meeting it.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, that's helpful. My last question is, I think it is a good idea for us to go after the race conscious measures, and it's clearly more intensive and extensive in the process that it takes. How do we find the funds to do that? Is this funding that we can support through grant funding, or do we carve that out in our annual budgets?
I'm not sure in regards to the actual source, but I believe this is carved out in our actual budget.
Got it. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Board Member Hensey. Board Member Jenkins?
Yes, I have several questions. On the slide that showed that firms, 84% of the firms were in San Diego County and 16% were out of the county. How is that determined? Is it based on address or because the main corporate office could be someplace else, but maybe they have, some of these large companies probably are someplace else and maybe just have people that work here. So how is that percentage determined?
Blanca?
It's based on vendor location. So we research each vendor if they have a location in this area. And as we confirmed that, we were able to confirm that the contract dollars were spent, 84% of the contract dollars were spent in San Diego and Orange counties.
Okay. And then, so what happens if we're using a particular vendor or they come up as being a particular vendor for a project, and we've had some sort of past history with them not working to our standards? Would we maybe have to consider using that vendor to meet certain numbers, or does staff make a decision if there's been situations in the past that haven't worked in our favor?
Let me start to answer that question and then kick it to Bradley about your processes. But there's nothing in the federal DBE program that would require use of any particular DBE. And the normal procurement processes, if a firm were debarred, for example, of working with an agency, it wouldn't matter whether that firm were a DBE or a non-DBE. It would still be DB. It would still be debarred regardless of the federal DBE program. There's no advantaging firms in that way under the federal requirements. Bradley?
Yeah, I'm just second what Dave was saying. In regards to the DBE status does not allow that particular contractor to do whatever they want and like fail to meet the standards of that particular contract and still get contracts. If we find that a particular contractor is not meeting what their obligations are and performing below the standards, it's addressed as any other contractor would without regard to or any special status for the DBE.
Okay, thank you. And then on your DBE participation slide, 2019 was significantly higher than the others. Is that just unusual? Was there a lot of work performed that particular year, or what was the reason for that to be so different than the others on that chart?
Yeah, maybe we could go back to that particular slide. And Blanca, I don't know if you recall, or maybe Bradley from memory, you might know if it was a particular contract in that year.
Yeah, for that particular year, there was a contract that was awarded race neutrally, a fairly large contract that was awarded race neutrally to a DBE firm. And so because of the size of the contract, it helped pump up the DBE participation for that particular reporting period.
And I think we're looking for the one with the bar, the vertical bars. There we go. That one. Yep.
Okay. Okay. So it was the size of the contract, basically. Correct. Okay. Okay. And then, excuse me. So there was discussion about outreach, trying to get more vendors to apply. How much control does North County Transit have as we reach out to these vendors over who applies? Because, you know, while we want to increase our outreach, there's probably companies that they just don't want to do work with the government agencies. So how much, what can we do in our outreach? Is it just a matter of substantiating that we did outreach, that we did do the outreach? Or are we supposed to have so much success from doing this outreach to try to get more vendors?
Let me start this question. Maybe Bradley has some more. You are absolutely right. So of the firms that we actually had in our final database, that was only a small portion of the total firms that we contacted in our availability survey. And we were purposely overly inclusive. We were calling, say, electrical contractors that may not have any experience, doing the type of, railroad power, the jobs that you have. For example, they might do residential in-home, electrical work, what you might have in your own home. But we couldn't tell that based on the list that we were getting. So we called them up and we asked them. Most of the firms that we successfully contacted said that they were not in that type of work or were not interested in public sector work. Exactly your point. So the information that we have here are firms that do the type of work that you do and are qualified and interested. At least they report that they're qualified and interested in doing that work. And that's an important thing to remember, that your contracts aren't for any firm in the market, whether they be minority, women-owned, or white male-owned. It's a small subset of firms that are going to be working with you. And there's no requirement to have broad distribution of that work across all minority, women-owned firms in Southern California. It's going to be the program recognizes it's going to be a fairly specialized subset of contractors and vendors, whether they be DBEs or non-DBEs working with the agency.
Well, and sometimes the amount of work that it takes to put the bid together, they may not have the staffing capability or the knowledge to even apply, let alone do the work.
And that's some of the
possibility too?
that's some of the feedback that we got. And to the extent that you can remove any unneeded paperwork, the red tape of working with government agencies, to the extent that you can remove that, some of that is not yours to remove though,
right?
Because you get federal money that, there's federal boilerplate in some of these contracts.
Right. Okay. And then my last question, you made a comment about that there was limited participation and comments received. I guess in my mind, does that maybe show that there's a lack of concern on them, with a lack of concern that they don't have a concern with what we're doing, so they have no comments?
Again, let me start the answer to this. I've done, close to 200 of these studies, many involving the federal DBE program, and I've also defended these programs in court. So where there has been litigation around these programs and people are very unhappy with what you're proposing, say, for example, they think your overall goal is too high, or they don't think you should be using DBE contract goals, we gave trade associations, other groups that we reached out to, which is a very thorough part of this process, I believe including some of those that have pursued litigation in the past with other agencies, they were reached out to. So they had a voice in this. And my interpretation of the very limited comments at the end of this, I think it's reasonable to interpret this as, acceptance of the results in the process. It's no guarantee that there won't be legal challenges in the future, but folks were made aware of this. Those that are concerned about fighting things that they don't want to see happen, put their energy elsewhere and not into letting you all know that they thought you were on the wrong course, is my sense of this. You never know, but I do have many times at bat with these types of proposed goals and these proposed implementation of programs, including in San Diego and other parts of California. And you got no negative feedback from what you propose in any material way. Bradley, I wanted to give you my sense of this from working with other agencies as well. I wanted to leave the final word on this to you, however.
Yeah, I mean, we did everything that we possibly could to get information out there, blasted it to all the vendors in our databases, actually reached out to 14 large trade organizations, minority organizations personally, left voicemails over weeks, left voicemails, sent emails, and did everything I could. And based off of that, it was just that one comment received back. And so from my understanding, from my experience previously, and from talking with Dave and Keen Independent, that it's fairly common to not receive comments back. That just a lot of these organizations and firms are just, they don't care until they want to get a contract, and then when they're looking through it, it's already kind of too late. And so, I mean, we did everything that we could ahead of time to let them know about, provide them advance notice of the outreach meetings. Actually had, we held 3 outreach meetings on different days and different times. We had afternoon sessions, nights, evening sessions as well. So we're doing every single thing we could. And it's just about, how much these firms and entities want to provide to us.
Okay. And then one last question I thought of. So as a result of this report, what is our liability? Do we have any liability as a result of this? Or it sounds to me like we've done everything we can and we're going to do outreach and all that, but does this report give the board, is there any liability as a result of this report?
And I pretend to be an attorney, but I'm not one. So Bradley, yeah, you got to field this.
No, that's okay. This is Lori, General. I'm happy to field it. I'm sorry, I'm not turning my camera on. I actually have a bad eye infection. So if you'll bear with me. There is no liability associated with this because this is required by the FTA for us to assess what the marketplace looks like, what our potential is for reaching disadvantaged business enterprises. And there's no penalty associated with non-performance. However, we do have to show that we've made good faith efforts to reach out to the communities, to reach out to the prospective contractors, and that we do provide some assistance in helping them to be successful in proposing and bidding on NCTD contracts. The thing that we have to do, as I think Bradley mentioned, if we don't meet our goal, we do have to do what's called a shortfall analysis and submit that to the FTA. And that basically identifies what our good faith efforts have been to meet the goal and what we intend to do in the future to try to get more participation. But that's pretty much the framework that we're working in.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions from either Board Member Hensy or Board Member Jenkins? Okay, great. Well, I think you both did a great job asking questions. I personally don't have questions. I just have some comments, and I just want to say thank you for the work that's been done on this. I think it's extremely important for us to transparently describe, the process, and appreciate, obviously, the thoughtfulness with regards to how this was conducted and what we're doing in terms of commitment and moving forward. And I did appreciate some of the comments made by Board Member Hensy as well with regards to how do we continue to, do more if and where we're able. So with that, I don't know if anyone else has any other final comments they'd like to make with regards to this, but I know there's no vote required for this item since it's informational. Any other comments from the board before I check in with Suhail? Okay, I don't see any hands raised. So do we have any other remaining public comments, Suhail?
No, Chair, we do not.
Great. All right. Well, with that, the next scheduled meetings are going to be, there's a special board meeting on July 12th at 2 p.m. and then a regular board meeting on July 21st at 2 p.m. And with that, again, thank you to all of our folks that joined us to present today. We really appreciate your time, and we will adjourn the meeting at 11:53. Thank you.
Thank you.